Good afternoon. I'd like to remind everybody in the normal safety brief, observe the exit signs and remember that we are adjacent now to a construction area, so if we have to vacate the building for any reason, you can see the red construction fence and recognize we'll marshal in the parking lot adjacent to that fence, and don't get yourself in a cul-de-sac and have to back yourself out of it. Could you turn that off, please? Okay. You know, this is a momentous year for Los Alamos. Not that the last one wasn't, but but as we get closer to determining our future, it's important that we get back to basics and understand the essence of who we are and what we do and why that is. And if I characterize this institution, I characterize this institution as a unique institution in the country. I guess one could argue that Livermore, we're not completely unique, that Livermore shares many of the same characteristics. But at least the two of us, ourselves and our sister laboratory at Livermore, which after all in the time frame of reference that we're going to talk about, were actually one spirit at that time, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the fact is, we have two salient characteristics in what we are and what we do that I think overshadow everything else. And in determining the future of the institution and what we do are the two things that can absolutely not be forgotten, or will be forgotten at great peril to the nation, I believe. And that is, first of all, that we are a science institution, first and foremost. And anything that changes that character, as I'll describe in a minute, I believe puts the country as well as the institution at risk. And secondly, we are a national security institution. And the way I characterize it is that there are only a very few places where national security meets the strength of American academic science, and that's here in Livermore. There used to be a lot more institutions in the country. There were the DoD labs and a variety of corporate laboratories where this sort of thing was done. Now there are only two that really do this on a large scale. And today we're very fortunate, as we consider that and the importance of that, to be able to talk to someone who will take us back to our roots, back to the dark days of World War II, when the University of California was called upon to set up an institution which would marshal the greatest scientists in the world, coupled with an extremely strong national need, national security need. And that in this team, there would not only be scientists, but also very practical scientific people who had a strong background in warfare, who could take and extract on a very tight time frame, extract that technology and put it to use for the nation. That is the heritage of this laboratory. And today, to help us remind us of that and to explore that, I'm pleased to introduce you to Vice Admiral Frederick Ashworth. So some people here at the laboratory who have been here in Los Alamos for a long time already know. For those of us who, like me, who haven't been there that long, don't know. But Admiral Ashworth will talk about his experiences here at the laboratory during the war and his wartime experiences even outside the laboratory. He was the Weaponeer. As a matter of fact, it's interesting that he will talk about how that was coined, who took part in the combat drop of Fat Man on Nagasaki. And he will be able to tell us about those experiences. He came to Los Alamos in 1944 a Navy commander during that part of the war, accomplished naval aviator, a naval ordnance person, of which there were about, I think, 12 or 13. Arleigh Burke was one, and there were very few in the Navy at that time, and he was one of the few. He served, after that time, was the commander of the 6th Fleet, retired as a Vice Admiral after being commander of the 6th Fleet in 1968, at about the time that a certain ensign was entering the Atlantic Fleet to serve in destroyers. We didn't meet at that time, sir, but, you know, we did overlap for a period of time in the Navy in our careers. And so it's a great pleasure. He, as I said, he flew the second mission, and he and the aircraft commander were responsible for making the decision for the drop. And please join me in welcoming Admiral Ashworth to the laboratory and his glimpse into our history, which I believe, at least in spirit, is also our future. Sir?
Oops. Thank you. That little slope there is so tough. Thank you very much, Pete. I appreciate the introduction. I would also say that early on, when this talk was suggested by Mr. Hopkins, John Hopkins, I inquired a little bit about what perhaps might be considered the reason for someone like me coming to make this speech or this talk. And the answer was, well, the people in the laboratory really enjoy hearing some of the old-timers come back, some of those who were here when. And so I think maybe I fit that category. And to prove that, I set up my credentials in that regard. I arrived in Los Alamos in Thanksgiving Day of 1944. My wife accompanied me, and I had my two children, one 18 months old and one 4 years old. We arrived at I was probably the only person at that time of the period of time that did not go through Dorothy Kibben in Santa Fe. But I was told to go directly to the laboratory, and of course I was welcomed in through the gate, no problem. But it turned out that after we arrived, I discovered that babysitters had been provided for my two children, and we were invited to a cocktail party at Captain Parsons' quarters. It was late in the afternoon, and as you might expect, the cocktail party turned into sort of a disaster. But the disaster really occurred when we adjourned from the cocktail party to a square dance. So don't get the idea, or never have the idea, that it was all work and no play at the Los Alamos laboratory in those days. I was assigned a set of quarters down where a big house used to be. There's a little plywood square, I'd call it a box, it literally was a box, had only one door. The heat was a kerosene stove in the middle of a large room. We had two small bedrooms and a little kitchen. My wife was required to cook on a kerosene stove, which is really not bad ordinarily, but this is a modern contraption I suppose perhaps developed here at the laboratory, which had a sump of kerosene, and when you turned on the valve, what it did was to let the kerosene into the sump. Then that would soak up through a asbestos wick, and after 10 or 15 minutes, one could put a match to the wick and get a light eventually working around. Then if you wanted to turn it off, you cut off the kerosene supply, and you waited until the wick burned out, and you had to put up with the odor that came out of the unburned kerosene. That quarters, Mel Brooks lived next to me in the same identical quarters that I had. He paid $52 a month for his. I had forfeited my $150 quarters allowance because I had been assigned government quarters. As far as cooking is concerned, we used the kerosene stove. We even rather quickly learned how to put a penny in the glass fuse box behind the fuse so that we could use electrical appliances like an electric oven. But it was really fun in those days. My 18-month-old son was in the diaper mode at that stage of the game, and we'd brought with us a Bendix washing machine. This was not one of the spring-loaded jobs that we have these days. This one was bolted to the deck, the floor. And when you had a load of diapers in that washing machine going, that entire square box we were living in would shake like that. There were also other problems. My 18-month-old son came down with pneumonia. I, as usual, was out of town. I was in the Pacific on an errand, which I will talk about in a moment. My wife decided the doctors advised that he must be taken off the hill. He was 18 months old. So my wife scraped up $800 and some to buy a ticket on the Chief back to Boston, New England, where she came from. And it turned out that the doctor who was going on leave, so he said, "I'll go back to Buffalo with you." And so throughout the trip back from Lamy to Buffalo, every 4 hours, he, of course, entered my wife's compartment to give Dave his 4-hourly penicillin shot. They finally arrived at Buffalo, and the Army doctor that had been doing all this sort of bade us goodbye in plain sight. And there was an elderly lady who had been watching these comings and goings all this time. And she said to Rick, my oldest boy, "My, you must be sorry to see your daddy leave." "That's not my daddy. My daddy's out there in the war." So I think that sort of qualifies me as being somewhat of you've heard thousands of these stories of how it was in the olden days. These are just a few of mine, so I think I really have qualified perhaps as being one of the old-timers who was here when. I've been frequently asked over the years, how did it happen that the Navy became somewhat involved in the laboratory work and the development of the weapons, and how come, for example, where there was a naval officer on each one of the Army Air Force aircraft that delivered the bomb? Well, I think the answer really to that is that the Navy, it turned out, was able to supply the right talent. And this comes to pass, I think, because the naval education system, particularly for regular officers, was probably better than the other services. The Bureau of Ordnance was an organization which did a lot of their work on in-house. They had their own development laboratories, and as a result of this, they generated a very high-grade, high-level, intelligent group of gunnery, ordnance-trained people. In addition to that, there was amongst these so-called Navy people are a lot of the scientific people, and I think probably they discovered that probably the Naval Reserve was probably the more interesting one of the three services. And so we find a lot of the high-grade, high-trained scientists here in Los Alamos at the time were Navy Reserve officers. Amongst them, Norris Bradbury, Commander Naval Reserve, Francis Birch, who ran the program, the development program for the Hiroshima bomb. Then there was Joseph Hirschfelder. Joseph Hirschfelder was a ballistician from the Naval Gun Factory. The laboratory was in trouble trying to figure out how to design this gun that would go in the Hiroshima bomb, and they called on the Navy to send them a ballistician. And this is a ballistics expert. And Joseph Hirschfelder was one. His information that he developed was turned over to the head gun designer in the Naval Gun Factory in Washington. And there the gun was forged, was designed, was forged and machined, and that was the gun that ended up in the Hiroshima bomb. In addition was the China Lake operation. The early castings for the implosion system, the Fat Man bomb, those were cast and machined. Those explosive charges were cast and machined at China Lake at the Salt Wells pilot plant. The Navy at China Lake were expert in this because they had developed the aircraft rockets which were propelled by cast propellants. And I just, at this moment, I can't help but comment that it looks as if the laboratory is still looking to the Navy for talent. But the number one individual in this group of Navy and Navy Reserve officers was undoubtedly Captain William S. Parsons, Deke Parsons to us. Deke Parsons was a graduate of the Naval Academy in the class of 1922. He was an ordnance postgraduate, had ordnance postgraduate training. He had been gunnery officer on several ships, and particularly the battleship New Mexico. At that time, the New Mexico main battery was having very difficult times with major errors in the deflection of their firing. Parsons looked into that problem and personally developed what the problem was and corrected it. At the time he was recruited for this job out here, he had been working with the production of the proximity fuse. The proximity fuse turned out has been considered, maybe I better take a swig. Water. Yeah, that might help. But the proximity fuse was being developed, and Parsons was key in that job with Vannevar Bush, Merle Tuve, and Larry Hafstad. And that turned into, have revolutionized anti-aircraft warfare. And in addition, it's a little known fact that the proximity fuse was also used in the Battle of the Bulge during World War II as an anti-personnel weapon. Some people consider that particular proximity fuse as perhaps not equal to, but perhaps close to the significance of the nuclear weapons as they were later developed. That's a broad statement, but I've heard that stated before. But Parsons was, as I say, our number one expert in the Navy. And if you would like to find out how Parsons contributed to the weapon development here, I would recommend to you reading the Los Alamos book, which I'm sure you will find in their library. It's called Critical Mass, the Los Alamos Laboratory under Robert Oppenheimer. And in that book, you'll find page after page after page where Parsons has put in his technical input into the development of the two bombs. Furthermore, Parsons was the driver behind this program and continuously trying to get the thing focused toward the completion of development. There are people who claim, and I'm one of them, although I may not be as qualified as I might be in that regard, that Captain Parsons was probably more responsible for getting the bomb out of the laboratory and into combat than any individual. Captain Parsons, after the war, I'll just briefly run through his experience, his duties after that, only because it's significant of the gentleman himself. He went back to Washington and established the 1st Atomic Division in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. He was the spokesman for atomic energy matters in the Navy Department. Admiral Nimitz, who was then the Chief of Naval Operations, who knew only as much as I was able to convey to him on a trip that I made out to deliver a letter to him, which I'll describe a little later, always depended upon Admiral Parsons for his advice in nuclear matters. Parsons was also very much engaged mentally in understanding the fact that the advent of nuclear power now permitted the Navy to come up with a true submersible, a true submarine. And that was proved shortly thereafter the war, when the Nautilus, the first nuclear-powered submarine, circumnavigated the globe submerged at the entire time. Then Admiral Parsons, he was spot promoted to Commodore, and as he put it to me one time, he said, that was just a dividend for what I did out at Los Alamos. But in the normal course of events, he was selected for and was promoted to Rear Admiral, and was, when the Crossroads nuclear bomb test against naval ships was established, he became the technical deputy to Admiral Blandy, who was the Joint Task Force commander. At the conclusion of the Crossroads operation, Parsons got his heart desire. He was sent to sea as a cruiser division commander. He had committed one tour in the Mediterranean and came back to Washington, and they made him the deputy chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. Admiral Parsons had a motto that governed his duties in his life, I think, in his entire time in the service, and that was, he said, there is no end to the good that one can do if he cares not who gets the credit. And I think that has characterized Admiral Parsons' entire lifetime. When he was chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, deputy chief of the Bureau of Ordnance, his door was always open. He took his work home at night. I think one night he woke up, had strange pains in his arm and perhaps in his chest. And in his inimitable fashion, he got out of bed, broke out his Encyclopedia Britannica, looked up, I suppose, angina, studied it for a while and decided that he did not have any problem in that regard and went back to bed. When Martha, Mrs. Parsons, found this out, she had him over to the Bethesda Hospital in a flash. He was given an electrocardiogram test. While he was lying on the table hooked up to the cables for the cardiogram test, the trace went to 0, and this great man passed away. I think perhaps I should at this time give a little bit of information on how my involvement in this program came to pass. I am sure that in the early 1943s and 44s, General Groves had it in the back of his mind the time when this bomb was going to be delivered in combat against probably the Japanese, although there was some thought at the time that perhaps it might be used in Europe. The Europe War, of course, overtook events on this, and so it was directed mostly entirely to Japan. But I think General Groves recognized that the Air Force people who were going to fly this bomb would not have time to train and also be educated in the technical characteristics of the bomb, so that in the event that anything went wrong during these combat missions, that there would be someone on the airplane who could make a sensible decision as far as the bomb itself is concerned. And I think that the obvious choice that General Groves had in this regard was obviously Captain Parsons. There was no one that in the military, a regular Navy, who knew equaled his capability and knowledge about the bomb. So General Groves always had spares for everything. He had spares for the plants in Oak Ridge. He had several reactors up in Hanford. And I think in this case he wanted a spare person we later called weaponeer. We coined this word because in the lexicon of the Air Force there was no crew member description which fitted this particular person. So we decided, well, we'll call it, for want of a better name, weaponeer. So he put in a requisition, or at least he asked the Air Force, the Army and the Navy, to nominate an officer to be assigned to the Manhattan District. His requirements for the officer were, first, he had to be a Service Academy graduate. That's Army, Air Force, or Navy. And the Air Force actually wasn't in existence at the time. He had nothing against reserve officers, but for this particular duty, he held in his own mind that he needed a regular naval officer. This individual that he asked for was to have some ordnance background training, some recent combat flying in the World War II theater, preferably in the Pacific, and a football player, preferably a quarterback. And it turned out that General Groves was a second or third string quarterback at West Point. But General Groves had put great stock in the training and the ability of making quick decisions and all that was developed in the football on the football field. Well, the Army came up with no nominee, and the Navy nominated me. General Groves accepted me in spite of the fact that I had not participated as a football player. So I was sent to, it's kind of a long story how I got my orders. I met Admiral Parsons in Washington. He told me to go over to the personnel and pick up my orders to the Army Air Force Base in Wendover, Utah. Wendover? I couldn't know about that. But I remembered as a child when I was about 12 or 14 years old, my parents made a trip across the country, and one of the places we stopped in our camping operation was Wendover, Utah. Needless to say, when I got there, I didn't recognize any of it. But when I picked up my orders at the Bureau of Personnel, the man who delivered to me said, "Well, I don't know what these are." And he said, "You're going to an Army air base." And I said, "Don't worry about it. I was just being then exposed to my first bit of the Manhattan Project security arrangements. He was not to know, I was not to know. I was only to do as I was told." I I picked up my orders, went back to Dalgan, where I had been stationed after a tour at sea. I told my wife I had to go to Salt Lake City, and she said, "Shall I pack?" Typical answer for a service wife. I went got in the airplane, flew to Salt Lake City, was met there by Norman Ramsey. He took me, when I got to Wendover, he took me through the security gate out into the desert, closed all the windows, and he said, "We are developing an atomic bomb, and you're going to help here at Wendover in running the component test program that's going to be going on. So that was my grandiose title of being supervising, to be the supervisor and the coordinator for the Los Alamos scientists doing their development testing at Wendover, Utah. And you have run it through your mind already, I'm sure, that the Los Alamos scientists at that time did not need any supervising and coordinating for a young, fresh-caught naval commander, and they were correct. Well, all this time the weapon development was going on. The gun assembly for the Hiroshima bomb had been frozen. As a matter of fact, the development had gotten to the point where it was felt that this was 100% possible, a probable, successful weapon. But in the middle of all this, plutonium shows up on the scene. Manufactured at the laboratory, I think at University of California, the accelerators there. It was discovered that that was fissionable, and this picked up a lot of attention because it looked as if that may be another way to do an atomic weapon. And microgram amounts of plutonium were coming into the laboratory. And one young gentleman by the name of Don Mastic, who was a microchemist, was doing some studies on some of this plutonium as it arrived in the laboratory. And somehow or another, the container, the bottle that it was under pressure, was in a gaseous form, got loose, and some gas escaped, and Mr. Mastic ingested 25 micrograms of plutonium. And he was told that this was 25 lethal doses. But in any event, through stomach pumping, they recovered the 25 micrograms of plutonium, and Mr. Mastic is still alive and kicking with no problem. The first attempt, of course, was to try and find out some way to use the plutonium in the gun system, which they were already familiar with because they were designing the uranium gun for that. But it quickly developed that this would not be possible on account of the spontaneous fission that was going on in the plutonium product that came from Hanford due to an isotope of plutonium-240 that had a spontaneous fission. The net result, any gun that they designed of this nature would have to be probably 10, 12, maybe 14 feet long, and the velocities to join these two masses of subcritical mass would be up in the neighborhood of 10,000 feet per second. Totally unacceptable as far as to try to design a bomb. General Groves, in his book, credits Seth Nedemeyer, who was at the laboratory at the time, with the idea of creating a plutonium critical mass by squeezing it. And a number of experiments were being carried out in that fashion, but not with very much luck. As my understanding, they were trying to do it in a lateral fashion. Captain Parsons told me one day, he said, Johnny von Neumann and I, Johnny von Neumann was a mathematician here in the laboratory, we got together and he said, we're going to lock ourselves in an office and we're not going to come out until we figure out how to use plutonium. And the net result was that they came to the idea of squeezing the plutonium in an explosive ball. Somehow they had to generate as the explosive wave front started, had to be generated in some fashion in a collapsing spherical wave. That was the problem at the moment. That problem was turned over to George Kistiakowsky and Norris Bradbury, expert. And they're the ones who designed the explosive lens, which ended up in the assembly into a sphere, so that when that sphere was detonated and 32 points around the sphere, Simultaneously, it generated this collapsing wave which squeezed this ball of plutonium about the size of a softball into the size of a billiard ball. And it went into an uncontrolled nuclear reaction, and the detonation occurred. Well, the Fat Man design was firmed up in September of 1944, but the test of the components continued, and the whole program was particularly delayed by the failure of the Raytheon company to produce some of the equipment that was going into this detonation system. But in 1945, it was since they felt that General Groves felt that they had an operable bomb in the terms of the little boy, decided it was time that Admiral Nimitz, who was then in command of the Pacific Ocean areas, should be informed of the presence of this bomb, and then it would be in his area around the 1st of August. And a letter was prepared to give him this information, and it was said, "Dear Nimitz," and it was signed King. That was the way they communicated between one another in those days, Admiral King being who he was. I was given the job of taking that letter from Washington to Guam to deliver it to Admiral Nimitz. In those days, we wore cotton khaki uniforms. I had this letter, obviously, I think it was actually undoubtedly written by General Groves, but it was labeled top secret, and I got procured a money belt, and I put the letter in the money belt, wrapped it around my middle, and I traveled from Washington to Guam in my khaki uniform, cotton uniform. Well, it was a hot, long ride. When I arrived in Guam, I made my way up to Admiral Nimitz's office, and finally his aide said, I met his aide, and I said, "I have an important letter to deliver to Admiral Nimitz." He said, "Well, that's okay, I'll take it." And I said, "No, I must do it personally." So he went in to see the Admiral, and he came out and said, "Yes, the Admiral will see you." So I walked into the Admiral's office, and the aide came on behind me. And I said, "Admiral, he has to go." And so the aide walked out. I unbuttoned my coat, I pulled up my shirt, and I opened up the money belt that I had, and I took out this rather disheveled, after 48 hours of riding in an airplane from Washington to Guam, the letter in its envelope, and I passed it to Admiral Nimitz. He opened it and read it, and what it said to him, that there was such a thing as they were developing now a nuclear bomb, that it would be in his area of operation about the 1st of August, and that he was permitted to permit one person on his staff to be aware to read the letter and be aware of the program. At which point he called in his chief of staff, Admiral McMorris, and handed him the letter. Then Admiral Nimitz said to me, "You go back and tell Admiral King," "Yes, sir," "that I cannot support this operation properly with only one person on my staff has knowledge of it. I must have my operations officer informed," who turned out to be Captain Tom Hill, who also turned out to be Captain Parsons' Naval Academy roommate, which is neither here nor there, but an incident. Admiral Nimitz read the letter. Amongst other things, he said, "This bomb will have a release of about 8,000 kilotons of energy." I notice 8,000 versus the nominal 20,000. I think the answer to that is that was probably the best guess of the laboratory, that that's what the yield would be. The letter also said gratuitously, I thought, that the bearer of the letter could answer any problems that he might have in the connection with the bomb. But Admiral Nimitz, one comment was, he says, don't those people back there realize we're holding a war out here? He says, February, is that the earliest we can get this? And I said, yes, and that's an educated guess without any question. He turned around and looked out the window for about half a minute, I guess. And he turned back to me and he said, thank you very much, Admiral, or Commander, excuse me. Thank you very much, Commander. I guess I was just born 20 years too soon. So, and it was during this trip to the Pacific that my youngster came up with pneumonia and was taken off the hill. So my poor wife was by herself on that operation, as many others were in the service those days. It was about this time, of course, in the spring of 1945, that it was the Project Alberta, which consisted of all the Los Alamos scientists and engineers to organize into the organization that would go out to Tinian to assemble the bomb, test it, and load it in the aircraft and send it on its way. And if I may, Roger, have that first one. If it works. I only show this, the group picture of the project of Alberta. I only show this picture to give you some idea of the size of the group. You may not be able to, you can probably pick out some of the people. There's Norman Ramsey right there. There's Francis Birch. There's General Farrell. There's Captain Parsons. There's Ashworth. There is, I don't know. There is Louis Alvarez, I believe, there. Roger Warner, right here somewhere. But this is the group that were organized as Project Alberta. Now that the group had been put together and divided up into responsibilities for the nuclear group, the bomb assembly group, and the rest, their shop lists were put together for their requirements at Tinian, and the arrangements were made for the movement of this group from the United States to the island of Tinian. And they all pretty much, this group was under the technical leadership of Norman Ramsey. Parsons was the military head. I had the title of being the military alternate, was also the operations officer. While this was going on to get the group organized and put together, the Fat Man unit components were continuing to be tested at Wendover. And also they were being tested at Wendover at the moment. So in May of 1945, the Alberta group was finally all assembled and collected on Tinian. And let's have another. This is a picture of Northfield on Tinian. This is probably the largest airport, certainly in the Pacific. And this is the airfield from which the B-29s made their attacks onto Japan, particularly the fire raids onto Tokyo and that part of the countryside. The next one, Roger. This group we call the Tinian Joint Chiefs of Staff. Norman Ramsey here, Captain Parsons. Colonel Kirkpatrick was the engineer officer assigned by General Groves to build the construction for the requirements of the group on Tinian. He was a class of 1929 at West Point, Corps of Engineers. This is Dr. Ed Dahl, who was responsible for the fusing. This is me, whose leg this is down here. I was told this morning, but whose name escapes me at the moment. So we call these people the Tinian Joint Chiefs of Staff. Kirkpatrick had been assigned a brigade of Seabees to Navy Seabees, which he organized and put in and supervised their construction of all the facilities that were done for the 509th and the laboratory groups on Tinian. Let's do the next one. There's another picture of the same thing. This again is Norman Ramsey Parsons and General Farrell. General Farrell was on the island as General Grove's personal representative. He was an Army Engineer Corps general and was a strong right arm for us out there while we were on the island. Another one. This is the picture of the building in which the bombs would be assembled, the bomb assembly buildings. This was under construction. There were 3 of those, if you can imagine, being built on Tinian. And the program at that stage of the game was that we would be capable of assembling bombs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Now, where all those were supposed to come from and what we were ever supposed to do with them, I was never aware of. But in any event, these were constructed out there. A prototype of the building was built in China Lake and was rung out there. They actually assembled some bombs out there so to test it, to be sure the building was adequate for the job before they sent it. The next one. These are all pictures on Tinian. This is the finished bomb assembly building here, just like just as we saw the other one under construction. And the next one. The building, all the laboratories and shops out there were these Quonset type huts. Each of the groups, the fusing group, the nuclear group, and some various assembly groups had their own shops and in the form of these Quonset huts, all constructed out there at the time when we got there. Another one. This is a typical office building we have there on Tinian. This turns out to be me busily doing my work, and this is Don Mastic here, the one who swallowed all the plutonium. You see he's very much alive and still around. I think that's probably all of those. So in June of 1945, Washington authorized the use of these bombs, but not before the 2nd of August. This probably relates to the fact that General Groves had set the date of the 1st of August that these bombs would be completed. And it was that date that was put upon the laboratory here, which they were working to for completion. And while this is all going on, the Fat Man, particularly the Fat Man bomb testing, component testing was going on because the little boy, the uranium bomb was considered to be in good condition, ready to go. Also, we did. They left when we moved out of Wendover. There was a test unit left up there as well, and they were carrying out tests on the Fat Man bomb at the same time. There are some very interesting figures in this regard. The first Fat Man, loaded with high explosive, with the X unit, the equipment in it to fire explode the sphere, was fired at Wendover on the 4th of August. Remember that date. The same configuration of a bomb was tested on Tinian on the 8th of August. On the 9th of August, the actual bomb was taken off and flown to Japan. That is probably, in my guess, would be, it was probably the shortest time of development between development and actual combat use of any weapon in weapon history. By this time, it was we of course have been a lot of thinking, and particularly in Colonel Tibbetts' mind, of what the delivery plan was going to be for this, and we were watching the weather very closely over Japan. Remember, the 1st of August was the date. The 2nd of August was also a date we couldn't get in before. The weather forecasts in Japan at that time said that there had been a tornado had gone through there, and that the earliest that this bomb could be dropped would be the 6th of August. Then they expected that there might be, probably would be, fair weather for the next 3 days when another typhoon would be moving in. It had initially been considered that it was going to take at least a week between the assembly of the little boy, the Hiroshima bomb, and the Fat Man Nagasaki bomb to get that assembly completed. With this set of dates, that program of a week was collapsed down to 3 days. And the assembly people there, Tinian, worked day and night to get the Fat Man ready to go. The operation plan for this operation was designed by Colonel Tibbetts, the commanding officer of the 509th Group, and it arranged, there had been, General Groves had organized a target committee back in Washington, and the targets that the bombs would be used against had been selected by this target committee. And they consisted of Kyoto, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kokura, and Niigata, which is a small city up in northern Japan, which is a main embarkation port for the Japanese troops going to China. The Secretary of War, Secretary Stimson, immediately objected to Kyoto. Said that if there's anything left of Japan when we get through with it, Kyoto must remain in its present state. It's the cultural center of Japan, and we cannot afford to destroy it. So Kyoto was removed from this list of targets, which left Hiroshima, Kokura, Nagasaki, and Niigata. The flight plan consisted of, there would be 3 planes in the bomb-carrying group of B-29s. One would be the bomb-carrying airplane. One would be carrying the instruments developed by Los Alamos and the Los Alamos scientific people to try to measure the yield of the bomb when it went off. The third airplane in this group would be carrying observers. We had aboard William L. Lawrence, who was the media pool man for the Manhattan District, was out of the New York Times. Had been totally informed on the whole program. Also on that airplane was Group Captain Cheshire, the only man, I think, as I understand it, in the history of the Royal Air Force who had been awarded a Victoria Cross while he was still alive. Prior to that time, the Victoria Cross, which is equivalent to our Congressional Medal, was always a posthumous award. But this is the observer that the British sent to go on these operations. There were two B-29s designated as weather scouts. They would go to both of the 2 targets. They had a primary target and a secondary target assigned. The weather planes would go first to one to each target in order to report back to the airplane with carrying the bomb what the weather was. The plan would be that the weather planes would take off an hour ahead of time before the bomb carrier group left. Then they would take off for the bomb carrier and the weapons carrier, the instrument carrying airplane would take off together. The flight would go from Tinian to Japan, rendezvousing the airplanes over Iwo Jima, so that they would then, except for the weather planes, these airplanes would then progress together to the target. Hiroshima was the primary target for the little boy bomb, and if we can throw the next thing. This is the crew of the Enola Gay. Incidentally, the Enola Gay was an airplane that had been signed to Captain Bob Lewis. I throw in these little odds and ends I think because they're interesting. It was this custom in the Air Force that the crew would get together to name their own airplanes. And it turned out that the crew with Tibbets and actually the plane was under the command of a Captain Bob Lewis. And he'd not gotten around to develop the name of his plane. So Tibbets, who decided he was going to use that airplane on this flight, sent somebody down to, without any reference to Captain Lewis, and said, paint Enola Gay along the side. And that's how it got to be called Enola Gay. This is the crew of the Enola Gay, plus some others. Let's see. There's Captain Parsons. There's myself in sort of a truculent attitude. I don't know quite why. This is Tom Farabee, who was the bombardier for one of the best, probably one of the better bombardiers in the Air Force at the time. This is the Dutch Van Kirk, who was the navigator for the Enola Gay. This is Paul Tibbets. Here was the pilot. And I don't know how Sweeney sneaked in here, but Sweeney was the pilot of the boxcar that went to Nagasaki. So this is the crew of the, short of me, was the crew of the Enola Gay. The Hiroshima mission, they were assigned the target. First target was Hiroshima, with the secondary target of Kokura. The Hiroshima operation turned out to be a textbook operation. And, well, it should have been. The weather was perfect. They had an experience, probably one of the better experienced strategic bombing command pilots, flying the airplane. They had a well-defined target. I enumerate all these things because it's so much different from what we had at Nagasaki. The target was well defined. It was a bridge across the river pretty much in the middle of the city. And the weather was perfect all the way. We know the results of the Hiroshima bomb. It went off within 15 seconds of the scheduled time. The bomb was successful, did its job, and the Enola Gay returned to Tinian and was met with all sorts of fanfare, and we had all the brass of the Pacific Ocean area present. And this is a group that was waiting for the return of the Enola Gay. And some of these, this is General Spots, who was the head Army Air Forces general in the area. This is General Twining, who became later the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. This was General Farrell. I've never been able to identify this gentleman. This is Norman Ramsey. This is Admiral Purnell, who was one of the members of Grove's Military Policy Committee in Washington. This is Francis Birch, I think, who developed the Hiroshima bomb. Sheldon Dyke, some of you may have known him. He was an aeronautical engineer. This, again, I'll not have to identify. Well, we all know oh, I have another slide there. There was great fanfare when this came back. Oh, this is another view of the same group. We don't need that any longer. There's myself and General Spots and General Twining. As soon as the Enola Gay landed on Tinian, Tibbets stepped out of the airplane, and this is General Spots, the head general in the area, just about to pin the Distinguished Service Cross on Paul Tibbets. It's been my opinion, and I've expressed this out loud to a number of people, that the Air Force shortchanged Captain Parsons when it came time to put out awards. Parsons had no decisions to make during the actual operation, but he did. He actually loaded the gun while they were on flight for the little boy bomb. He was responsible for it. He personally identified the target and reported the same to the pilot, that verified that he was indeed attacking Hiroshima. Admiral Parsons was awarded the Silver Star. I've always felt that he was shortchanged by the Army, but that's neither here nor there. So now came time for the next bomb, the Nagasaki bomb. This mission was intended to fly exactly as. Let's have the picture of the. This is the front end of the boxcar. Boxcar being the name of this airplane, because it had originally, in the organization, it had been assigned to Captain Bach, and with the crews getting together to decide their names for the airplanes, there was a rather obvious course of events that named it Boxcar. The flight plan for our trip to Nagasaki with this bomb was planned to be identical with the plan for the Hiroshima operation. The problem being, however, that there was a storm over Iwo Jima, and we were unable to rendezvous over Iwo Jima, and we were required to fly directly to the Empire, and we picked a small island off the island of Kyushu called Yakushima, over which the airplanes would rendezvous. While the boxcar was being checked out by the flight engineer, Sweeney climbed out of the cockpit and came over to talk to Colonel Tibbets. And we got a picture here of. This is while we were waiting for the takeoff of the boxcar. This is Tibbets. Tibbets here, and I'm here. This is Admiral Purnell again. Sweeney climbed out of the airplane and came over and said, "Boss, I can't transfer the fuel from the after bomb bay tank into the main system." And he said, apparently the fuel, and we haven't got time to switch the bombs into another airplane. And he was essentially asking Tibbets what to do. Tibbets says, "You don't need that gas. That gas is only in there for weight and balance purposes on account of the 10,000-pound bomb up in the forward bomb bay." And he said, Tibbets essentially said, "Get on with the mission and do not spend more than 15 minutes at the rendezvous." Now that becomes an important point later. Tibbets Sweeney got back in the airplane. We all boarded and took off without event and headed for Japan. We arrived at the rendezvous point. On the way up during the transit from Tinian to up to the area of Japan, the electronic assistant that I had with me, who was taking the pulse of the bomb through a little black box that he had that Leon Smith knows all about, was able to check the storage battery condition, the firing circuits, the fusing circuits, and all the rest of the part of the bomb. One of the tests that we made on the way to Japan, all of a sudden a light came on the test box, and what that said was, this bomb is now fully armed and ready to fire. According to that signal, if we'd had a spurious signal into the fusing system, presumably, I think there are the details which wouldn't have caused this to happen, but this light went on, and it stayed on. Well, this got to be a little consternation on our part, and I thought it was time to let Sweeney know what was going on. And so I climbed up to the front cockpit, and I said, or we're up in the front office, and I said, we got a little problem back here, but we're going to take care of it. In the meantime, Phil Barnes, who was this electronic assistant, had broken out his blueprints, and he'd taken the sides off this test box and started going through the circuits. And he discovered that there was a missetting of one switch. He put that in the proper position, the light went out, and everything was fine. Except, later in the writing by the Air Force, it's been told about this story, is that a flashing red light had come on. Well, a flashing red light sounds pretty dangerous. And that's been made a big point by the Air Force that we were really in trouble because we had a red light flashing off that test box. But it amounted to nothing, and we continued it on the way. We got to the rendezvous, and within 5 minutes, a second B-29 arrived on the scene. I'm back in the navigator's cockpit. All I had to look out was a port in the side of the airplane about this big around. And I was not aware of which airplane it was that had arrived. But after 15 minutes, when we should have been proceeding on to the target, I went up to the front office again and talked to Sweeney, and I said, look, I don't care about the third airplane being that one with the observers, but we must have the airplane with the instruments in it. Well, it turned out that everybody in the airplane but knew that was the instrument plane that was with us. But Sweeney has written in his book that he considered it more important that all three airplanes can continue together to the target. Remember Tibbetts' admonition, no longer than 15 minutes at the rendezvous. So we have now the second airplane. The third one hasn't shown up. After another 15 minutes, I went up to the cockpit and I said, Chuck, we got to get going. Let's get out of here. And it was another 30 minutes before I finally went, second time went up and said, we cannot wait for this guy any longer, and I don't care. And so we finally headed for Kokura. Now, when you start adding these time periods up, we spent about 45 minutes, I guess, at the rendezvous, burning fuel all the time. We had 600 gallons of gas in the after bomb bay. We couldn't use that because they couldn't transfer it into the system. Why remains to be seen, but so we proceeded to the primary target was Kokura. The Japanese call it Kokura. The weather was fine up there. We had received the report from the aircraft scout, the weather scout, saying that the weather was good, and indeed it was. So we tested, ran through the tests on the bomb for the final time. We started on the bomb run. Major Behan, Captain Behan was the bombardier, was working on his bomb site. Target was fine, but as we began to get closer to the target, there was haze and smoke, and we passed over the target, and Behan says, no drop, I can't see the target. So the question now is what to do. I've heard later that Tibbetts had told Sweeney that the operation order required that if Sweeney was unable to drop this bomb on the primary target, he should abort the mission and bring the bomb back to Tinian. I was not aware of that. As I was telling the gentleman we had lunch with this today, I guess that I was at the flight briefing, but I have absolutely no recollection of the pre-flight briefing. Of course, it was about midnight, and I might have been asleep, but I doubt that under the circumstances. But presumably, Sweeney was supposed to have abandoned the flight, returned it to. I would have objected seriously on that because I knew that it was Washington's policy to try to drop these two bombs as close together as possible in order to avoid any idea that we only had one. So they wanted to have this gap between these two bombs as short as we could. Incidentally, General Groves used to be asked how many bombs did we have. His answer was always enough. We couldn't drop on the first. I went up there trying to kind of converse with Sweeney up in the front office again, and sort of expecting to have him suggest something of what he was going to do next. And nothing came, so I said, "Why don't we make a turn around and come in from a different direction?" He accepted that suggestion. It was not my right to make any decision of this kind. We went around, took another pass at the target, and the same thing. The smoke was covering the target. We couldn't see it. We were operating under specific orders from Washington that under no circumstances would that bomb be dropped other than through the Mark 15 Navy bomb site. Or in other words, a visual sighting of the target. So Sweeney made a third approach at the target, and we still couldn't drop it. So it was time to head for Nagasaki. There's another 50 minutes of valuable fuel burned up. So we headed for Nagasaki. The weather report from the weather plane said the weather was clear. But indeed, as we approached, as far as we could see, it was a solid overcast. And as we proceeded closer and closer to the target, however, it still looked that we were not going to be able to make a visual approach in there either. I went up and talked to Sweeney, and I said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "I think we need to make this approach on radar, and if we have to, we'll use the electronic bomb director to drop this bomb. Hopefully, Captain Behan, the bombardier, will be able to pick up the target because what was now beginning to look as if it was broken clouds and not overcast." And this turned out to be the case. We have another photograph here, just one more. This is a picture of the bomb going off actually at Nagasaki, but the reason I put this in here was to indicate that indeed there were large holes. Now, the story has been that as we approached Nagasaki, magically a hole opened up, and Behan, the bombardier, was able to pick up the target and synchronize his bomb sight and drop it visually on Nagasaki. It wasn't a magic opening of a hole. There was really only about 3 or 4/10 cover, and he was able to pick out a target that he synchronized his bomb sight on and let it go. We made practiced our turn away from the two, scheduled a turn away from the blast, and tended to get us away from the bomb as quickly as possible. And when the bomb went off, we were probably maybe 10 miles away from it. It was obvious from what we saw that the bomb had gone off technically okay. Some of us thought that probably it was more than had a more obvious success than the Hiroshima bomb. But we made, then next thing happens, the shock waves hit the airplane. It was something like shark bumps you get when you're flying commercially, bump. There was one, and then there was two, and then there was three. Some of the people in the airplane claimed there were five. To me, there were only three, and my description of this shock wave hitting the airplane was almost exactly if you took a tin trash can and hit it with a ball bat. There was more noise than anything else. We didn't get thrown around, as have been some stories that we did. So we turned around, made one pass around the target and headed for, since the engineer about this time had concluded, look, you guys up in the front office, we're darn near out of gas, so we're going to be out of gas. We haven't got enough fuel to get this airplane back to Tinian. We're lucky if we can reach Yontan. So we made one circle around the tower of smoke to see if we could figure out where the bomb went off, and headed for Okinawa. It was necessary to send in a strike report at this time, and this was done by the means of a code that we'd worked up ahead of time that consisted of names of fruits and certain numbers and certain categories in this code. For example, the code we finally sent was a certain orange one that said Nagasaki. We said the time, General Greenwich Civil Time. The next one was conference required before any public release is made. That was one of the things we had doped out ahead of time as a possibility. The next one was technically okay. Another one was, again, picked out from this code. Another one was about the same as Hiroshima. And the last one was trouble in aircraft fuel preceding Yontan Field, Okinawa. So we headed for Okinawa in a long, slow glide, engines back. When we arrived at Okinawa, the pilot called the tower trying to get landing instructions, and like any big airfield like this, there was a lot of chatter going on and nobody paid any attention to him. There were airplanes going in all directions. So finally, Sweeney was playing it very smart. He was flying very close to the field. And he went on the radio and he said, this is his name he had, I'm coming in. And he told the navigator, you fire all the rockets we have, the Berry pistol rockets out the side of the airplane. They were usually to announce trouble in the airplane. The red one said we have wounded aboard. The other one said we're short of gas. And so Sweeney said, fire them all. So the navigator pushed his Berry pistol through the side of the airplane and started firing flares. And so we kept continuing making the approach. I looked out the pilot's window from where I was back in the navigator's compartment, and I could see the end of that runway out there, not very far. And there was a little bulkhead about 18 inches high between the flight deck and the navigator's compartment, and I was down in a small ball with my back up against that, because I was sure that we were going to, without any question, run off the end of that runway. We were so high in that approach. Largely because Sweeney had played it smart. If he had lost his engines, he wanted to be close enough in so he could make a glide to the field. So we landed, almost took a B-29 out while we were doing it, I found out later. Came to a screaming halt at the end of the runway as they full reverse on our props. And we were met by ambulances and fire trucks and everything else looking for the wounded and all the rest of it. So we taxied back to the line, and on the way back two engines, the outboard engine stopped operating. Fuel starvation, presumably. I've often wondered whether it's normal practice in driving a B-29 when you're taxiing, you cut the inboard engines and taxi with the outboard engines, because you got a better control of it. But the story is that those two inboard engines stopped from lack of gas. In any event, we got up to the operations line, and the next problem that I had was to get an amplifying report back to the base. So, the first thing we did was, shortly after we arrived, the instrument plane that was with us, he arrived, and then Hopkins, who was in had the observers aboard, who had never shown up at the rendezvous, he arrived. And I got out my target maps, and we put them on the front of a Jeep, and I said, we've got to figure out where this thing went. So Behan and Sweeney and myself and Hopkins and Captain Bach looked at this map, and we finally decided that the bomb had gone off directly over the Mitsubishi Arms and Steel Works in the Urakami River Valley, which was in the major industrial area part of the city of Nagasaki. So that was the next problem, was to get a message, an amplifying message back to the base. So Sweeney and I went out in the street, and we commandeered a Jeep with a young driver in it. I had a shoulder holster with a .45 caliber pistol in my, I guess in my arm, which was, I guess, was a pretty good persuader. But this lad stopped, and we said, take us to General Doolittle's headquarters. General Doolittle had just come over from Europe from the 8th Air Force. And I finally got to the communication tent. I walked in there and told this colonel that was in charge, I said, I introduced myself, Commander Ashworth, and I said, I have an important message I have to send back to my base. And he essentially said, run along, little boy, I'm busy. So I said, well, where is General Doolittle's tent? They were all in tents at this point. And he pointed up the road, as much as to say, that won't help you either. But I went up there, and we found General Doolittle's tent was a double pyramidal tent. I knocked on the door, and somebody hollered, come in. And there was General Partridge, who was Doolittle's chief of staff. And I told him, I said, we just dropped I was the spokesman for this. Sweeney was kind of in the background, where I think he belonged. And I told General Partridge we'd just dropped the second bomb, atom bomb in Japan, and I was having trouble with his communicators getting out a message. Could he help me? He said, yes, I can help you, but you better talk to the boss first, General Doolittle. So he took us into General Doolittle's office. I guess Sweeney went in with me. I don't know. He now writes it up that in his book, precisely the story that I am now relating. So which one is, I know which one is correct. But I laid the maps that we had, the target maps that we had out on General Doolittle's desk, and I said, well, as we were supposed to be hitting down here in more or less the center of the city, I said, but we're quite sure that the bomb went off up here in the industrial part of the city. And he looked at it for a while, and he said, you know, he said, I think General Spots will be much happier that the bomb went off up there in the industrial area instead of over the city. There will be far fewer casualties. And he said, now I'll take care of your communication. He called the communication officer and says, send the commander's message when he gets there. So I wrote up a detailed letter, message, and sent it back to our base. We have one more slide. In this conversation we had with trying to decide where this bomb had gone off, Sweeney Tibbets, the bombardier, mentioned very clearly, he said, I aimed I aimed at a racetrack. And it probably is a stadium, and it's right there. Now, this is a before picture taken before the bomb at Nagasaki. This is the picture taken afterwards. And if you'll notice, right, just barely clear, but right there is what's left of the racetrack. So you see from 30-some thousand feet, this is 1,000 feet from the ground. This was determined later to be the ground zero. Behan, the bombardier, had probably missed his target, the racetrack here, by not more than, 600 feet? That's pretty darn good bombing from 30,000 feet. So that it gives you an indication of. I've always said that Captain Behan was the unsung hero of this operation. He has never gotten the credit that he should have had. I've described the situation that we were in as we approached Nagasaki. Behan recognizes immediately that I have only one chance of dropping this bomb. There's no chance to go back a second time. We haven't got gas enough and still get ourselves back to a friendly territory. So he was under the tremendous pressure of having to drop that bomb and drop it accurately. And this, you have seen the results, which I think is, and Captain Behan, in my estimation, has never been given credit for that marvelous performance of duty. Turned out also that same day there was Behan's 27th birthday. Well, there's been a lot of critiques about, as you can see from this, I'm sure you've gathered a couple of conclusions. And that is that it wasn't a very well run mission. Was the airplane commander really in charge? I had to go up and prompt him a few times. Wouldn't you recognize immediately that there was not a well-defined responsibility between the airplane commander and the weaponeer? I was up there talking to him about things he ought to be doing. That was not my responsibility. My responsibility was with the bomb itself. There's a bit of incredible information which may come as a surprise to most of you. This was Sweeney's first combat mission. He had made a couple of runs, I think at least one run with a pumpkin, which was the training bomb that we'd put together with like a fat man bomb with a high explosive in it, and those were provided to the air group for training purposes. Sweeney had made one of those trips. That trip he had aborted and also jettisoned the bomb itself. So there have been a lot of controversy and critiques of this operation. Colonel Tibbets has written in his book, largely which in many instances he said if Sweeney had told Ashworth to shut up, there wouldn't have been any problem. I admit that Sweeney should have told me to shut up about the making a couple of approaches at Kokura. The General Dr. Alvarez, who was out there at the time, has written a letter 20 years later to General Groves. And he said, I don't know, General, whether you have ever been told the full details of the Nagasaki operation, but I think you really ought to know about it. And he proceeded to tell them about all the mistakes that we made all the time while he was sitting back on Tinian. His final conclusion was to General Groves. Let's see, how did he have it written? It says, this was the most abominable run mission in the history of strategic air warfare. General Groves answered that question, that letter, and I saw his answer. It was very, very short. It said, It has never been my policy to Monday morning quarterback successful operations. Japanese capitulated 2 days after the Nagasaki bomb was dropped. So that's my story. But I'd like to thank you for this opportunity for one who was there, an old-timer, to tell you of some of the successes of the story of Los Alamos. The never-before completed scientific effort of the Manhattan Project, the creation of the bomb here at the laboratory, and its first use in warfare has been classified as the most significant event of the 20th century. That, I say to the laboratory, this is your heritage. Guard it well. Now, after the war, when Robert Oppenheimer prepared to leave the laboratory, he gathered his associates and friends together to say goodbye. I was not privileged to be there, but I can see that meeting just as clear as crystal. Here was this intellectual giant of a man, small in stature, almost wraith-like in figure, sometimes called even emaciated. I knew him slightly, but I held him in awe. Undoubtedly, he was wearing his famous pork pie hat. And he said these words, and I'd like to read them because I would be sure that none would be misused out of a lapse of memory. If atomic bombs are to be added as new weapons to the arsenals of a warring world, or to the arsenals of nations preparing for war, then the time will come when mankind will curse the names of Los Alamos and Hiroshima. The peoples of this world must unite, or they will perish. This war has ravaged so much of the earth, has written these words. The atomic bomb has spelled them out for all men to understand. By our works, we are committed to a world united, united before this common peril, in law and in humanity. Now, after having read those words, I have to say very humbly, this to you in the laboratory, this is your challenge. Meet it boldly and meet it with courage. Thank you. Thank you very much. Roger and I agreed before we got here that I would be perfectly willing to open this to questions. I don't know how long it'll last or how long any of you want to stay here. I hope it beats working. But if indeed anybody would like to throw some questions at me, Roger is prepared to carry a microphone around and shoot them at me, and I'll be glad to try to answer them. Otherwise, if there aren't any, I think that's... Does anybody have that feeling at all?
Two quick questions. What happened to the fuel pump on the plane? And do you have a favorite Harold Agnew story?
Roger, somebody will have to translate that for me because I gave my hearing to my country, flying airplanes.
Shall I try again?
What? Oh, the fuel pump. After that airplane got back, what happened to the fuel pump was the question in the boxcar, that we couldn't transfer the gas from the after bomb bag tank. After we got back, the flight engineer boxcar, the regularly assigned flight engineer, got in the airplane, flicked the necessary switches, gasoline was transferred. I think what that says is that in a large airplane like these B-29s, there are all sorts of idiosyncrasies between aircraft. And what the situation that the boxcar engineer had gotten, he reached the point where he knew exactly what little tweaks he had to give his systems to make them work. And I think this is what happened here. The engineer from Sweeney's crew tried to do it like he normally does it, and it didn't work. That's the whole answer. There really was nothing wrong with them.
Do you have a favorite Harold Agnew story?
Huh?
A favorite Harold Agnew story?
Huh?
Do you have a favorite Harold Agnew story?
A favorite Agnew story?
Yeah.
No. No, I wish I had a favorite Agnew story. I knew Harold Agnew quite well. He went out there with us with the project. I should have pointed him out there in that group of the Alberta group. But Harold Agnew was just one of the boys with us. He was, by that I mean I think he'd recently graduated, but matter of fact, I think he actually went back to college to get his degree after the war was over. But he of course later came to be ultimately the director of the laboratory. But as far as any stories are concerned, I have none at all.
I was wondering about the third airplane that had the observers. What happened to it besides showing up at the end?
Did this real story of the third airplane ever come out where it was?
Oh, the third one? Oh. Well, that's a good question too. The pilot of this airplane was Major Hopkins, who was the operations officer for Paul Tibbets, the 509th. He was obviously an experienced pilot. The best of our knowledge, we don't know what happened to him. It's never been determined why he didn't arrive there at the rendezvous with the rest of us. He had this group captain from the Royal Air Force, the Victoria Cross man, who had also been doing bombardment, flying over Europe. In his later comments, he couldn't understand what in the world could be going on through this Hopkins' mind, because at one point he was up as high as 39,000 feet, presumably. Apparently he was in the area, but it's an interesting point to make that Sweeney and Hopkins had some kind of a minor altercation before the airplanes left that had to do with how they would make their rendezvous. And I never learned what this was all about, but apparently Sweeney had no confidence in Hopkins arriving there at the proper time, and it might well be in the vice versa, I don't know. But so that's, to answer your question specifically, that has never been determined as far as I know, and it was shortly after the war that Major Hopkins was lost in an airplane crash, so it'll never come firsthand from him.
Sir, I have no question, but I would like to salute you personally and say thank you very much. I would have been dead many times if that did not happen.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
My father served in Bataan, walked the Bataan Death March, made his way to Camp O'Donnell, to Camp Cabanatuan, and was ultimately sent on the Onakamaru across the Sea of Japan to the Japanese mainland. He was working in some coal mines. He passed away 10 years ago. He was 78. He was working in some coal mines near Nagasaki. I'm going to get through this. And he, among many other soldiers, heard that blast. And in stories that he told us as we were children and growing up, he said, "Son, I got to hear the last hostile boom of World War II. And someday I'd like to thank that man. So as my father's personal representative, thank you."
Well, in connection with that, I can't help but make a very short comment. There was a friend of mine, a Japanese lady, who is now working. I'm not sure she's an American citizen. She's married to a Japanese, but she's certainly totally Japanese. She has dedicated a lot of her time to trying to get restitution for the prisoners of war for the amount of money that they should have been paid for their slave labor in the coal mines and the mines in Japan. Unfortunately, this apparently is sort of a hopeless thing to have happen, because the peace treaty between the United States and Japan specifically says that all this peace treaty cancels out all future claims. But she has been working even to the point of going over to Japan and to talk to the Japanese Diet. And in that connection, we'll get back to a little bit of atom bomb stuff. You probably recall a while ago that the Enola Gay people put some of their memorabilia up for auction with eBay was early on, Butterfields in San Francisco, and there was a gentleman from San Diego who bid on the one of the green plugs that had been taken from the Hiroshima bomb, which was being auctioned off by Morris Jepson, who was the electronic assistant on the Enola Gay. He paid $167,000 for that plug. There were two others, one of which Ed Dahl, who was in charge of fusing, took, and he gave it to Mrs. Dahl, or gave it to Ed Dahl. Sometime later, he died. Mrs. Dahl has that hanging on a hook in her kitchen. But the point I want to make about this is that my Japanese friend got a hold of, had copies, bought 200 copies of a Dr. Tenney's book, which were his experiences in the Japanese mines. And he paid for 200 of them, and he and my Japanese friend went to Japan and distributed them to the Japanese Diet. So there's been, she has not had much luck. I don't know that any case has been solved in this regard, but at least here's a Japanese woman who is working on that program.
There were clear indications after the Hiroshima bomb that the Japanese were surrendering. So what was the need to drop bomb on Nagasaki?
Was the second bomb necessary? Was the Nagasaki bomb necessary?
That's a good question. The question was, if you didn't hear it, and I had a hard time doing it, was the second bomb necessary? Well, that I think is one of these hypothetical questions you really can't answer. But I think there are a few important points that should be brought up. And I mentioned one during my talk, that Washington wanted very much to try to drop at least the two bombs that we knew we had as close together as possible in order to remove any thoughts that the Japanese might have if we only dropped one, that might be the only one we had. The argument being, why did we drop the second one so soon? And we didn't give the Japanese time, even time to capitulate. But the reason that was done was to create at least the image that we had at least two and maybe more. And I think that was definitely a military policy on the part of the people back in Washington, General Groves and the Secretary of War and those involved. So was it necessary? That I think is one we'll never know. But I think from that point of view, the fact that it was dropped immediately was, to my way of thinking, the convincer. Hirohito was in the position then of saying, hey, wait a minute, how many more of these do we have? And I think that's exactly the attitude that Washington was trying to promote with this idea of bringing these two bombs together as closely as possible.
Where did the name Enola Gay come from? Does it mean something, or?
Well, I mentioned that. Where did it come from? The Enola Gay was Colonel Tibbetts' mother's name. Maiden name, perhaps, since his name was Tibbetts. And he told the whoever in the air group did that kind of thing. This was, I think, the morning before the day before, the night before they took off for Japan, to go down and paint Enola Gay on the side of Bob Lewis's airplane. In connection with Bob Lewis, there's on the 40th anniversary of the bomb, Time magazine came out celebrating the articles on the 40th anniversary. And on the front page of Time magazine, they quoted a thing was alleged to have said by a statement which was led to have been said by Captain Bob Lewis, who was flying co-pilot for Tibbetts. And what was quoted on the front of the magazine was, "My God, what have we done?" In actuality, Bob Lewis was keeping a log. As a matter of fact, he was talking on a microphone that was being recorded on the airplanes in a communication system. And what Bob Lewis actually said was, after that bomb went off, "My God, look at the son of a bitch burn." Now we're getting into the real inside stuff.
Yes, sir. Was there a contingency plan or a recovery plan in place if one of these bombs didn't light, which would amount to us airmailing one of our greatest secrets right into the enemy's hands? A little mangled, but...
What would you have done if the bombs had not detonated or you ditched one?
If it,
Contingency plan if you had ditched a bomb or it didn't go off?
would we have ditched it?
Yeah, what would you have done? What was your plan?
Okay. The question was, were there any plans that we had in case we would be required to have jettisoned the bomb? I got a letter a short time ago from a man by the name of Find, who wrote the book Downfall, which was the story, a very, very good story of the last few days in Japan. And he wrote me a letter, and he said, I get a lot of questions for people who are interested in my book and what I wrote about, and they keep saying, they ask me that specific question. What were the plans for the jettisoning of the bomb? And he asked me this, if I would answer that question. So I wrote him back, and first I said, well, I referred him to Norman Ramsey, who was probably in closer communication with anybody, with Washington on that. And I told him, and I say right now, to the best of my knowledge, there were no plans. I was never, well, let me go one step further. The Target Committee, which is an organization put together by General Groves to try to pick out the targets that would be used on this by these bombs, was having a meeting here in Los Alamos. And I've seen the minutes of this meeting, and one of the parts of this minute says, they said, we wonder whether or not Commander Ashworth has had instructions on how to jettison the bomb if it turned out to be required. And I've since seen that minute. The answer to that question, to the best of my knowledge, is no. As far as I know, I don't recall at any time ever had a discussion with anybody as to what to do in order to jettison it. I think there are a number of things we would have done, obviously. One would be put the safety plugs back in, those that isolated the arming system so they wouldn't have that, so the thing wouldn't go off in the air like it's supposed to go. We probably also would have pulled the arming wires from the contact fuses that were in the nose of the bomb. But I think the definite answer to that is no. I had no instructions on what to do about it. Of course, we were confronted with that problem, I think very clearly when we're heading for Nagasaki, and we haven't got much gas left. We probably, with the little gas we had left, we probably would not have been able to haul the bomb back into Okinawa, purely and simply as a result of its 10,000-pound weight. I think if we had have tried, we would have had to either jettison or ditch the airplane with it. But fortunately, that's a decision we didn't have to make.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question on that. Do you know anything about contingency plans that were in place in Okinawa in the event that you had to return with the bomb in the airplane, specifically if there was a crash that would occur on the base? Do you know if there were any contingency plans for that?
Was there a contingency plan if you had taken the bomb to Okinawa and with the possibility of a crash?
Oh, I don't know. Well, no. The question was there a contingency plan if we'd taken the bomb back to Okinawa? No, and I don't think there was one required, but if we had have taken it back to Okinawa and we would have had enough gas, there is no question we would have landed with the bomb, and I would hope that would have been a better performance than the actual landing that we made. But they had a provision in Iwo Jima. They had a loading pit down in Iwo Jima in case we had to stop on the way and then unload the bomb, for example, or bringing it back if we had to unload it. Then we could stop off in Iwo Jima and unload the bomb there. But there were no plans. These questions really bother me because I can begin to see, one, maybe my memory has gone bad, and we did indeed have some of these instructions, but two, which is more important, is I scratch my head And I wonder, why didn't I know something about that?
Thank you all very much for coming.